Hey crafty friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Juliana and I'm so happy you're here today. In this video, I'm sharing some fun techniques using the new Tim Holtz mini archival ink pads. Tim originally released 12 mini archival ink colors back in 2019. Well, now that family has grown and there are 12 more colors available in the archival ink formula. If you aren't familiar with archival ink, it's a waterproof ink that's permanent on most surfaces and it won't bleed when you combine it with water-based inks, watercolors, paint, or markers. These techniques and the cards I created are coming up next. So today I'm sharing some card background ideas using the new Tim Holtz mini archival ink pads. This first technique is ink smushing. The other supplies you'll need for this technique are distressed specialty stamping paper, a glass mat, and a mini mister filled with 91% isopropyl alcohol. Because archival inks are waterproof, this technique won't work with water. To get started, I smushed the Salvage Patina ink pad onto my glass craft mat and spritzed it with the isopropyl alcohol. Then I smushed the paper into the ink. I repeated this process until I liked the look, and I used my heat tool to dry the ink. You can also let the ink air dry. I used the heat tool because I wanted to speed up the process. As always, anytime when you're working with any kind of medium that you are spraying, make sure to work in a well-ventilated room. I continued with the ink smushing using prize ribbon and then villainous potion. You'll notice this technique takes these rather dark colors and makes them much lighter and translucent. I also love how doing one color at a time allows the layers to build and create more depth and dimension. Once the ink smushing was completed, it was time for some stamping. Here is where the archival ink really shines. I began with a mix of stamps from Tim Holtz, including Field Notes, Flower Shop, Glorious Garden, Specimen, and Ledger Script. For the first layer of stamping, I began with a lighter color of ink to help build layers. I applied Salvage Patina to the Glorious Garden stamp and then dried the ink using my heat tool. Archival ink does dry rather quickly, so you can definitely skip this step. Just make sure to let the ink dry to avoid smearing it before moving on to the next stamping layer. Continue to repeat adding more layers of stamping using images from the various stamp sets. As I progressed, I used darker ink colors. On the second layer, I used Frayed Burlap with an image from Flower Shop and the Ledger Script stamp sets. Here I'm laying out the next layers of stamps just to get a better idea of the placement. On the third layer, I used prize ribbon with stamps from Field Notes and Specimen. For the final layer, I used Villainous Potion with the moth from the Specimen stamp set. The final touch of interest I added were some ink splatters. To achieve this, I smushed the prize ribbon ink pad onto my glass mat, spritzed it with the isopropyl alcohol, and used a long, thin paintbrush to splatter the ink onto my background. I then followed up by drying it with my heat tool. I tried this technique with both distressed specialty stamping paper and alcohol ink gloss cardstock. Personally, I prefer the specialty stamping paper because the stamped images are slightly more crisp. The other difference is that the specialty stamping paper is matte, whereas the gloss cardstock is shiny. They both, however, create beautiful ink smushed backgrounds, so you really can't go wrong using either one of them. Now on to my second card. Once again, I'm using archival ink. This time I'm adding a stencil and some distress microglaze for a fun resist technique. On this card, I'm using alcohol ink glossy cardstock. I placed the Tim Holtz tile stencil on top of the cardstock and applied Distress Microglaze through the stencil using a finger sponge dauber. I applied a thin layer of it through the stencil using a pouncing motion. After applying the glaze, I used a heat tool to completely dry the glaze. I'll warn you now, this takes several minutes, but it is way faster than letting it air dry. If you have time to do that, it's certainly an option. I also recommend using a pair of tweezers when drying the paper because it does get really hot. Once the glaze is completely dry, it's time to begin applying the archival ink. I used a foam blending tool to apply the ink. Here I used Kitsch Flamingo, Wild Honey, and Crackling Campfire and applied them in different sections onto the cardstock. I continued applying the ink until the entire surface was covered and the resist design was revealed. As on the first card I shared, I added some stamping, beginning with a lighter color and progressing to a darker color of ink with each layer. I applied Kitsch Flamingo to the Glorious Garden stamp and then dried the ink using my heat tool. I continued to add layers of stamping using images from the various stamp sets. On the second layer, I used Frayed Burlap with the images from Flower Shop and Ledger Script. On the third layer, I used Wild Honey with the stamps from Field Notes and Specimen. And for the final layer, I used Crackling Campfire with the butterfly from Specimen. I absolutely love this archival ink resist technique and all the depth and dimension you get. I tried this same technique on both Distress Specialty stamping paper and alcohol ink gloss cardstock and got very similar outcomes, so feel free to use either one of these papers for this technique. I did notice, however, that the more finely detailed a stencil was, the less likely this technique worked. I had better luck using stencils that had larger openings in their design, such as the Tim Holtz Mosaic and Lattice Work stencils. To finish off both of these cards, I added a sentiment from the Tim Holtz Metallic sticker book. I hope you enjoyed learning these fun techniques using Distress archival ink. All the supplies I used here can be found below in the description box. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.